you're actually better off just taking the singular compound that you need before the type of session that you do. Hello and welcome to the Smart Strength Training Podcast. This is podcast episode 33, and we are coming in on a heavyweight topic today: supplements. Specifically, are supplements worth the money? When I first started this podcast, it was to be able to delve into more evidence-based topics, and supplements are probably one of the main reasons that I wanted to do that. So it's been a long time coming, but let's go. So the supplement industry is worth $177 billion estimated in 2023. It's reported that 71% of UK adults take some sort of supplement every single week. So we know it's huge business, and we know a lot of people are interested in supplementation. Now, for the sake of this podcast, it's a strength training podcast, a sport and exercise science podcast. So I am going to keep my focus on sports supplements, and I appreciate that is a compartment of supplementation overall. So I'm going to be looking at things that are going to be popular for strength and endurance trainees. What we're going to cover is the clear hierarchy that exists within supplementation. I want to talk about some of the recent concerns about supplements containing banned substances, and also contamination with heavy metals, which has been a popular thing in the last few months. So this is coming out in sort of February 2025. So the last 6 months to a year, there's been some research and some sort of concerns about heavy metals in supplementation. So first up, let's go through the hierarchy. There is a clear hierarchy that supplements sit within. So top tier 1 supplements are proven. They are highly effective. They are backed by strong research, and this research is consistent. So therefore, when we do meta-analyses on that particular supplement, it always comes up showing the same thing. So we've got clear benefits, we understand the mechanism, it's proven to do what we think it does, and it's often endorsed by sports or health organizations. Tier 2 are then supplements that are usually context depending. So they usually have a moderate amount of research, but they're usually only useful in certain situations. So some research will support them, but it's very much based on particular elements of your training that you're doing overall, but not universally going to be necessary. Okay, tier 3 is then your minimal research or niche supplementation. So this is often where new supplements come in at when they initially are discovered and come to market. So you usually have either small limited research or more often inconsistent findings. So we find that often initial research onto a supplement gets people quite excited. People become early adopters to that particular research, and then backed up research that happens up 6 months down the line, a year down the line, they're not able to replicate the same findings, or the robustness or the sort of magnitude of those findings is nowhere near as much as those initial papers. And I would say this is also really important to recognize, because I see a lot of this happening where early research comes out, people get very excited, it goes on to like popular podcasters, they talk about the research, and then no one seems to talk about the fact that the next research paper that basically replicates the exact same research to make sure that those findings are possible to replicate are not replicable, and therefore the sort of initial excitement starts to dumb down. And it's important to recognize that. And then tier 4 are going to be unproven or potentially risky supplementation. So there's either usually no evidence on the supplement, or there could be potentially harmful effects. So tier 1, proven. Tier 2, situational, might be useful in certain contexts. Tier 3, unproven. Tier 4 is going to be a risky supplement. So we want to really focus on the stuff we know that's going to work. So tier 1 supplementation. There should be no surprise, and this supplement needs really no introduction, but creatine monohydrate is the most researched sports supplement that there is on the market, potentially followed up by one other supplement, but there's over 1,000 research papers on creatine. We can hand on heart say we know what it does, what mechanism it works under, and we know it's proven to do its job. So I've touched on this before, but what creatine does, by taking creatine, you're going to saturate your phosphocreatine stores. Your body uses adenosine triphosphate as its primary energy currency. So when you break down a adenosine triphosphate cell, you are effectively releasing one phosphate group, and then by having phosphocreatine stored in your muscle, it can donate one phosphate group, so we can rapidly replenish ATP. We know what it does. It's been proven to show it works. And you're looking at about 2 to 5% increase in performance, and that performance is very much aligned to higher intensity types of training. Strength training, sprint training, something that's quite short in duration and high energy. And research on that is very, very consistent. So it's taken by strength athletes, bodybuilders, anyone that's involved in like sprint-based training. Number 2 is protein supplementation. Now, protein is obviously a food supplement, but it falls under sports supplements because it's so useful in the recovery process. I think most people are aware that your muscles are made up of proteins, amino acids, and protein powders are a complete form of protein. So if you're trying to focus on your recovery from bouts of training, recognizing that exercise is damaging to your muscles, and protein is a really important part of that. Why protein supplementation is useful is it's highly bioavailable, so the body can get at those amino acids really quickly, and it's digested really fast, so you can rapidly uptake those amino acids into the bloodstream, which has benefits beyond, let's say, just regular protein on itself. So again, we know what it does. It's been proven to show it works. It's useful for anyone really, but ultimately, I do think whole food first. So if you're able to get protein in your diet through whole food, great. For those that struggle, then I think protein powders can be a really good thing to go for. Or if people are needing to have recovery in place through a liquid form between going from one bout of exercise to another late in the day, and digestion is something to think about. So there are certainly situations where protein powders probably are better than whole food, but generally speaking, I would say whole food is most important. Number 3 is arguably the second most researched sports supplement out there, which is caffeine. So we know it's an ergogenic aid for endurance and for strength training, but more so for endurance, and helps with focus. So caffeine blocks adenosine receptors, which reduces fatigue and increases alertness. It also stimulates the central nervous system, increasing power output, and it helps mobilize fat stores and spares glycogen. So it's useful for endurance athletes. What I would say about caffeine, obviously it increases alertness. So we know that caffeine is certainly very useful. When you look at the dosages used in research, we see quite high dosages. So we're looking at between 3 to 6 milligrams per kilo of body weight, taken 45 to 60 minutes before training. So for a 60 kilo woman, a low dose would be somewhere around 100. So we're saying 3 milligrams per kilo body weight. That's around 180 milligrams of caffeine before training, up to as high as 360 milligrams. So a shot of coffee is around about 63 milligrams of caffeine. So you're looking at about 3 shots of coffee, 3 to 3.5 shots of coffee. For an 80 kilogram person, that's going to be 240 milligrams up to 480 milligrams. That's looking at about 4 to 6 shots of coffee to get that ergogenic aid. So as much as caffeine is a very useful supplement to take, I would suggest that the average person is not getting the ergogenic effect of caffeine simply because they're not taking high enough dosages. And there's also some question marks over the habitual caffeine drinkers and them getting that ergogenic aid. So caffeine is very, very well researched. We know what it does. But I would say the majority of caffeine drinkers probably aren't getting a sports performance effect. If that's why they're drinking coffee, then it's worth looking into backing off their caffeine consumption for a bit. And then when they are drinking coffee, do it on usually their longer session days for alertness and to increase that caffeine dose. But a lot of people on that sort of caffeine dose, they're going to have some side effects, jitteriness, and just not feel great on it. So it's one to think about. But again, we do know what it does. The next one sort of sits between tier 2. I more recently heard that it was being recognized more as a tier 1 supplement, so I'm going to put it in at tier 1 with a little caveat against it, which is citrulline malate, which enhances blood flow, reduces fatigue, and supports endurance. So it increases nitric oxide production, which therefore leads to vasodilation, so widening of blood vessels. So this improves oxygenation and bringing nutrients to muscles to delay fatigue. Very, very useful for endurance athletes because this helps build or reduce the buildup of ammonia in the bloodstream. So it's all about that delaying fatigue. Citrulline malate's been knocking around for a little while. It's certainly a supplement that is having more and more research on it. More and more of that research is starting to show that it does have benefits. Again, more so in the endurance space, and dosages for that look to be around 6 to 8 grams between 30 to 60 minutes pre-workout. So let's now move down to more to tier 2, the context-depending supplements. So the first one going to come in here is beta-alanine. Beta-alanine got a lot of excitement maybe 10 years ago because it buffers lactic acid and delays fatigue, which is very, very useful, again, in certain contexts. So any type of training that a lot of lactate is produced. So we're talking about like CrossFit, high intensity intervals, sprint intervals on the rower. But rather than being the very, very short duration, we're thinking about anything over about 30 seconds to a minute when you start to experience a high level of blood lactate, because it increases the acidity, disrupts the muscle contraction and leading to fatigue. So it's got a really interesting action on the human body. But again, it really is only useful for certain people. I would say the average person working out certainly wouldn't need to take it every time and would only need to take it if they are experiencing a high amount of blood lactate in their workouts. One of the main issues with it is you get that tingling feeling, which is completely harmless, but can be a little bit off-putting if you're working out, and you can feel that. The next tier 2 supplement are nitrates, so beetroot juice, also very similar to citrulline malate in the sense that it is a vasodilator, so helps with endurance overall. It's less effective in the research. You need consistent dosages. People quite like nitrates because it comes from beetroot juice, so therefore it's a more kind of like seen as natural supplementation. But if you're taking it every single day, that can cause issue with GI tract. But it's certainly an interesting supplement for those that, again, are engaged in endurance activity. But I would say that citrulline malate does beat it in the sense that it's got more vigorous research behind it. Next is tart cherry juice. Tart cherry juice is tier 2. Lots of great benefits, it seems, anti-inflammatory and for recovery. It's rich in, I always say this wrong, anthocyanins, which reduce muscle soreness, inflammation post-exercise. So a lot of people take it when they're doing a lot of workouts per week and they need to delay fatigue and maybe help with soreness a little bit. You do generally need quite high dosages of it, and it seems to be quite variable on an individual level for how effective it is, but some people swear by it. I must say, when I've taken it, I've never really thought it's done an awful lot. But I know some of my friends and people I really respect in this space, they really rate it. So worthwhile thinking about. Electrolytes are the last tier 2 supplement. Not going to touch on these too much. Certainly, I think electrolytes they're having their moment in the industry. There seems to be a lot of brands coming out. They certainly are useful for people that have issue controlling their hydration level. But once again, that's not going to be everyone. If you don't sweat a lot, you're not doing long bouts of training, you don't live in a hot climate, you're probably not going to need electrolytes around your workouts. I think they're very useful for those that are going off and doing events that they're not used to doing, marathons, ultra events, things that are much longer in duration, your first high rocks, for example. But I think for the average person going into the gym in an air-conditioned space for 45 minutes, they're not needed. They're getting a lot of very kind of like sexy packaging, but I don't really see the need for most people outside of maybe the summer for long sessions outside, that kind of stuff. Coming down to tier 3 supplements. In here, so we're going to talk about minimal evidence or niche cases. So the only one I'm going to talk about here is branched chain amino acids. BCAAs, if you are hitting your total daily protein intake, they are not particularly useful. You probably could put branched chain amino acids, the essential amino acids, and not necessarily leucine, but potentially leucine in isolation as well in tier 3. Leucine potentially you could say is tier 2. It's not going to give someone any kind of major boost. They are, again, we're talking about more nutritional supplementation. If someone's eating enough whole protein, enough complete proteins, then branched amino acids and essential amino acids probably aren't going to be something you need to think about. There is often some talk if people are on a plant-based or strict vegan diet that might be quite low in leucine, so potentially supplementing on leucine. Again, that could be quite useful, but it's not going to be something that is going to offer huge sport enhancement recovery benefits overall, because they're just too small a thing in isolation and there's more elements to recovery to focus on. They are the main supplements from the tiers that I wanted to talk about. Let's go into third-party testing and effectively safety. If you know anything or read anything, heard anything about supplementation, it might sound like the Wild West. It's not heavily regulated. The only regulations that are in place are more around labeling to make sure that the labeling is correct. Even then, I would say that's probably quite questionable, certainly when it comes to when it's being researched. And there's no strict penalties in place for companies if they are not adhering to their labeling. A few research papers have come out recently that have shown contamination with effectively banned substances. This always centers around the pre-workout space because we're talking about stimulants and ultimately you're looking at some sort of performance enhancement coming from that. And in some research papers, it's been shown that there are compounds in there that are banned by WADA. And for most people, that's not the end of the world if you've got a supplement that is banned by WADA unless you are a competing athlete. But I think for most of us, there are probably concerns. I don't want to be taking things that I don't know are in my sports supplements. This is just a personal thing. You haven't got to believe this or take this. I don't really love the use of sports supplements for pre-workouts. I think caffeine is going to be the most effective thing in there that's going to give you a boost. As you've already heard, sometimes these things have beta-alanine, citrulline malate in them. They're context depending. If you're doing endurance work or if you're doing high intensity intervals, you're actually better off just taking the singular compound that you need before the type of session that you do. You find that most mixed pre-workouts are going to have various stimulants in them, and caffeine really is the one that's going to be the most effective for what you want. And in that sense, I would just go to the actual supplement itself, go to a reputable brand, make sure you're going to someone that you trust, which we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, a lot of the kind of worry about contamination seems to stem from this research into pre-workouts. Third-party testing is really important. Some of the big brands do their own in-house testing, and you can see this on various websites. Obviously, it really depends on the type of supplementation that you are taking, but you should be able to clearly see on the label where that testing is done. Very much stick to the big brand. I would these days not recommend going to marketplaces like Amazon. I certainly wouldn't buy supplements that are made from small batch. A lot of personal trainers or bigger personal trainers online sell supplementation. I would be very concerned to hear that people were buying supplements from those brands. I would go to the big brands in your country, because they'll be able to show that third-party testing. You can even ask for it if you're considering it as well. Next up is heavy metals. So heavy metals, this has come out probably more so in the last 6 months. So heavy metals or traces of, generally lead is the main heavy metal that people are seeing or that is coming up in the research. I have a few queries over what I've been reading recently in this sort of space. The research that came out has come from a third-party clean supplement research company, but the actual evidence wasn't supplied in that research, just the end findings. And I query this sort of thing because they give their list of clean supplements at the end. which just feels like it's probably going to be endorsed and paid for. So I don't know how much I trust some of the more recent research that's come out on this, but it does seem to be the case that plant-based organic protein powders, especially if they're chocolate flavored, have a higher amount of trace lead in them. And chocolate protein powders as a whole do seem to have higher ones. So if you are concerned about heavy metals in protein powders, I certainly think we need a lot more research on it before we can start getting too carried away on the more limited data that's come out recently. Then I would move away from organic. This is one of the things around organic. Obviously, organics food sounds good. It's got less pesticides, so it's less sprayed. But that also means that it spends more time in the soil. It can draw in more heavy metals. So when it comes to non-organic plant-based proteins, for the sake of this topic, it actually could be really useful to step away from those. And of course, stepping away from the chocolate flavor could also be useful as well. But again, I would like to see more research before I get too carried away with this. But like a lot of things, these aren't necessary. I don't think that pre-workouts are necessary. I don't think that protein powders are necessary. So the best thing you can do is just not use them as a whole. You can get your caffeine from coffee, you can get protein from whole food, and you can completely step away from any worries about contaminants coming from banned substances and the potential harm of heavy metals. Also, of course, I don't think dietary protein powders are a good thing to take every single day. If people are struggling to get their protein intake, there are other ways to do it than going down the protein powder route. But I think it's really important that you are aware of these current concerns, even though we need more research on them. So that's it. We've covered a lot. I'd love to hear your feedback, what your thoughts are on these topics. Do you take any of those supplements? Do you find they work for you? Supplementation, like I said, it's an interesting area. I think if we circle back as the final note, the research into the most effective sports supplements is creatine. And I spoke about a 2 to 5% benefit from creatine, which it's significant, but it's not a huge magnitude. Creatine came out years ago, before I stepped foot into the industry in 2000. Nothing has come out since that has even come close to being as effective as creatine. So I'd always be very, very cautious about being an early adopter to a supplement when we know they're not going to be as effective as something like creatine. So you're going to get marginal gains off a potentially risky supplement. So I think that supplementation is a super interesting topic. There are certainly some things within the context of this podcast that I think you should consider for your own supplementation, but I don't think they're as required as a lot of people probably consider them to be.